Okay. Thank you. Well, my name is Donley Studlar, and I'm the lead author here on this presentation in regard to proportionality and policy change in non-communicable diseases, cases of tobacco and obesity compared. I have to say it's a pleasure to be talking in the Indiana room here in Chicago in 2006, because I'm a graduate of Indiana University, and actually my first Midwest conference was in 1974 down at what was called the Pick Congress, now called the Plaza. It was a much smaller operation 42 years ago. So I've been here a few times in the interim. So as you'll see, what we're doing here is largely a research design in which we're blending literature both from public health, because my two collaborators are in public health, and also public policy, and particularly comparing the political struggle comparatively against tobacco, which most people would say has been relatively successful over the last half century, with what you may see increasingly in your newspapers and media, and that is what should be done in regard to obesity. In the UK now, they're talking about bringing in a sugar tax, for instance, and this is going on in other places as well. And there's lots, particularly in the public health literature, there's lots of comparisons that essentially tobacco is a model, and we need to do something similar in obesity. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and actually Dr. Mamudu, even though he's in public health, was my student in political science. So we want to apply a political science perspective to this. Again, Emmanuel is a former White House advisor, and here in effect he's saying something about the process, and then in contrast to those who would say we're not moving very fast on obesity, he says, in effect, we're moving faster than we did on tobacco. So that's sort of a tagline for us. So that is roughly an outline of my talk. And again, I have lots of slides here, so I'm not going to bother to talk about them each individually. Again, this is all part of non-communicable diseases, and despite the fact that communicable diseases obviously get the headlines, particularly when there's an epidemic, but non-communicable diseases account for 60% of all deaths. And these are the diseases, but the policy component comes in terms of the major causes of these diseases are well known, including tobacco use, physical inactivity, an unhealthy diet, and overconsumption of alcohol. And we want to compare the evidence that exists in terms of what causes these diseases, and therefore including recommendations from the World Health Organization, and the EU and other bodies, with what actually governments do. And it's a confluence of several pieces of literature. We've been attracted to the literature from the Israeli scholar Moshe Maor the last few years, in which he talks about policy overreaction and policy underreaction. And his most recent piece, he talks about negative policy bubbles. In effect, there's lots of evidence that suggests that maybe some ameliorative policy action should be undertaken, but little of anything is done. So it's the opposite of policy, overreaction. And in effect, he's saying there's a long-term policy under investment. So we want to see whether that's applicable in these cases. Again, we're concerned with public health issues, and we want empirical data that demonstrates if there's some sort of scientific consensus at the international level, but still policy lag. Again, we're concerned with non-communicable diseases. We base our policy model on what we did, Mamudu and myself and Paul Kearney, in a book on tobacco in 2012. And we also want to look at particular policy instruments and how coercive the policy instruments are, and whether there's a similar sort of ladder of policy instruments in terms of tobacco and obesity over time. I mean, for instance, here by a well-known obesity and food researcher, Marion Nestle, and she talks about degrees of coercion involved, and in terms of obesity, the degrees of coercion are very little. I mean, it's largely been education and self-regulation. With tobacco, we see increased over time, again, as we demonstrated in our book, and as I'll illustrate here, there was increasing amounts of coercion, and certainly not prohibition, but what we call neo-prohibition, that is trying to reduce smoking and tobacco use to the lowest possible level. So in terms of this hierarchy of regulatory instruments, heretofore there's substantial differences, although as I suggested, at least in some jurisdictions, they're now moving into taxation in terms of dealing with obesity. Again, these are some things about our methodology. The paper is online, by the way, if you want to get it. This is from my public health colleagues, a few graphics, so to speak, about what tobacco does to the human body. We have another one for obesity. This is in terms of what's happened in tobacco control, and this is periodization which we've employed in various outlets, journal articles, and books over the years. But again, we say this is roughly moved in phases, and of course, actually, we started having evidence about the harmful effects of tobacco, pretty systematic evidence, in the 1950s, at least in the Western world, but in reality, not much was done, certainly until 64, or 62 was the Royal College of Physicians report, 64 the Surgeon General's report. But here's what people forget. Not much was done for 20 years thereafter. A few countries, US and Scandinavian countries, had some coercive instruments like health warnings, but by the mid-80s, there really weren't many health warnings in the world, and most of the policy response was in terms of education, in terms of searching for safer cigarettes, some bans in terms of television advertising. So there wasn't a lot done until the 1960s or until the 1980s. What happened in the 1980s? Secondhand smoke essentially concerns sort of socialized the issue, and we've seen a flood of responses since then, of which since many of you are health-oriented people, I'm sure you will appreciate in your own societies. It takes a few of us older people to remember things as they were before then. Anyway, I won't go into that in detail. We're certainly happy to take questions. So our argument essentially is that tobacco control would seem to constitute one of these negative policy bubbles, because we had scientific evidence from the 60s, we had some scientific evidence from the 50s, authoritative reports in the 1960s, and yet not much done until the 1980s. And the World Health Organization was very much involved in this too, pushing the agenda forward. What we employ here is this 5-factor model political process that we did in the tobacco book, where we talk about shifting agendas, institutions. For instance, if tobacco control is going to be taken seriously, the health ministries need to get more control of the issue rather than the finance and trade ministries. Famously in 1954, the British health minister, looking at the evidence, he was a smoking health minister, by the way, he looked at the evidence and said, well, cigarette smoking would seem to be a danger, but we can't afford to lose the revenue for the exchequer. So, the political struggle that goes on, we talk about, networks or interest groups, and obviously we have not only the industry, but anti-tobacco groups or anti-obesity groups, things that are going on in society in terms of the socioeconomic dimensions, public opinion, smoking rates, etc. And we also talk about ideas and the diffusion of ideas, essentially, in terms of what's possible. So, this essentially I've already talked about this slide in terms of the history of tobacco, slow policy reaction due to vested interests in some governments. But again, there were international factors involved in this. Sort of an emerging international consensus about the dangers of tobacco use. Again, the World Health Organization was instrumental in that, and we have some detail about that, which I won't go into here. How much time do I have left?
But 3 minutes.
6 minutes?
3. It's actually according to the official time.
Okay, I'll try to observe that. All right. And of course, the culmination in the international sense in tobacco control is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in 2003, which is the first treaty on health in the world. That's the framework in terms of spreading the message that smoking is dangerous and taking measures on a worldwide basis that countries commit themselves to. Again, some general comments about risk factors for non-communicable diseases. Again, we have some lessons from tobacco control we can talk about. So let me talk a little bit about obesity and again related to the concept of policy bubbles and wrap up. So there's our public health chart on obesity, and obesity really didn't become an issue until the early 1990s. There were some nutrition reports earlier, but in fact, if you look at the progress of obesity, and you can track the progress or regress, you might say, about tobacco use, but ditto on obesity. Obesity really took off, so to speak, in the 1980s, and it became, in terms of the physiological sense, and then there began to be some concern in the 1990s. Again, particularly from the European Union and the WHO, there have been a whole series of reports in the last 25 years, including a couple of Surgeon General's reports and international conferences. We document all these in the paper. We argue that there seems to be a policy underreaction to this as well, and insofar as amelioratory measures are taken, they tend to be largely of the self-regulatory sort. The companies are often asked to cooperate to involuntary measures in order to reduce the obesity, producing ingredients in food, whereas the tobacco companies, on the other hand, have become pariahs, essentially. So we argue that essentially it's this harm regulation model that still seems to be operational in obesity, where again, in tobacco, it's become in effect neo-prohibitionism, that the tobacco companies are considered an illegitimate player, they're not paid attention to, they're not consulted, and of course there are more coercive measures employed. This is a comparison chart. Again, it's in the paper in terms of higher assessment of that. Okay, well, what does all this have to do with Mayor's theory about policy underreaction? So we say there's three questions we can assess here, and we've got some hypotheses. The first, we're interested, from a general political science theoretical sense, how do negative doubles form? Again, we've got some hypotheses, which I won't go into in detail. The second general question is, what causes a negative policy bubble to dissipate, okay? As it did in tobacco, we would argue it really hasn't happened yet in obesity, and hence this tobacco envy, so to speak, by those who say, can't we follow the tobacco model for obesity? And the third thing is that one can also compare tobacco and obesity in terms of what's happened within this common conceptualization. And again, one indicator of the fact that people are increasingly comparing tobacco and obesity is two interest groups, Consumers International and the World Obesity Federation, proposed an international treaty on nutrition. This was to a conference, international conference on nutrition. They proposed some measures. In effect, they said if we had a framework convention on tobacco control, we need a framework convention on nutrition, with the major concern being obesity. Again, this is not under negotiation, but these sort of proposals are now on the agenda, coming from non-governmental organization. So, then, in terms of our conclusions, this comparison suggests that yes, evidence is necessary, but one has to appreciate that there's a political struggle over appropriate regulation. And I mean, for instance, it's been a hard work to get the British Conservative government to actually say that a sugar tax is needed, because industry's response to most proposals for regulation is that this is the nanny state and people have choices and they should be allowed to have choices, etc. That structural changes may be needed to facilitate policy change. One difference that we see between tobacco and obesity was tobacco is essentially a bubble-up issue. There were non-governmental organizations and some governments that were concerned about it, and yes, who was involved, but it was basically bubble-up. The Framework Convention was sort of a culmination. Note, there's a proposal for, in effect, an obesity convention, even though individual jurisdictions, states and others, haven't done that much in terms of coercive policy in regard to obesity. So in terms of multi-level governance, it seems to me that it seems to us that obesity is more of a top-down issue, at least in terms of the process, than bottom-up, and that if obesity is really going to move in the same direction as tobacco, then there may need to be conceptual and policy instrument changes, particularly moving from the concept of harm regulation or harm minimization towards some form of neo-prohibitionism. Of course, what I haven't said is increasingly sugar is viewed as sort of the key ingredient in obesity. Just as, of course, there was a long dispute about what caused diseases from tobacco smoking. What caused lung cancer and what tobacco smoking actually contributed to it, but eventually it centered on nicotine as the addictive ingredient, and then but nicotine is not what does the harm; it's the other things. But again, there seems to be increasing consensus that about sugar as that ingredient, because there is a considerable debate about why people get fat. All right. So the general conclusion is that tobacco may be a model, but following its course of effective regulation may be difficult and may take a long time to emulate. Thank you very much.